Alright, I am back with another video, and today we are doing a non-modded build. For those of you that don't know, obviously patch 7 has been released, which means that modded builds are now much more accessible to the general populace, and will eventually be coming to consoles next month. So while I am sprinkling modded builds here and there, this one is just going to be a normal build today. A build that I always thought I had done, but when I actually looked back over the channel, apparently I haven't, so here it is coming to you today. We are building the Shadow Guardian. The Shadow Guardian is kind of my attempt to do a build that is based on the lore of the Shadow Druids. For those of you that don't know, the Shadow Druids were a group in Act 1 that were basically responsible for all of Korg's bitchiness. They are a group of druids, or a circle of druids, I should say, but are dedicated to basically eradicating mankind so that nature can flourish. That's a very broad stroke to describe a very complicated kind of group, but there wasn't that much information about them that was easily accessible online to kind of look. But basically, the long story short is that their mantra is that mankind in any sort of group, whether it be a village, a town, or even the grove itself with the refugees, basically is encroaching on nature and needs to be eradicated so that nature can thrive. So they're not exactly the most understanding people in the world, to put it simply, and I wanted to do something based on the Shadow Druid lore, but I didn't exactly want to do just a Shadow Druid, just making a druid that is all spooky and evil, because that would be a bit boring. So I wanted to try taking it a slightly different direction. So I'm thinking, okay, with a very combat kind of focused circle of druids, let's say, perhaps they've employed some more martial warrior-esque kind of characters into their ranks. Maybe not as full druids in the typical sense, but maybe characters that are, you know, kind of able to, you know, survive in nature, know their stuff similar to a druid, but are also more combat-focused and more able to use like things like armor and heavy weapons and such like that. And that is what we've got here today. We're going to be building a kind of shadow druid warrior, the Shadow Guardian, the guardian of nature who strikes from the shadows to deliver devastating blows onto the enemies of the natural world. And I thought that was a pretty interesting concept. Make them a drow, half-elf, so we can have a beard, and, you know, you've got a pretty interesting and compelling character there. The character, in fact, is a Celadrin drow, because I don't think this drow would be Love-Sworn. Love-Sworn would be a bit more focused on that kind of religion and that way of life, whereas Celadrin is someone who is still broken free, but in this case still has quite a bitterness towards the other races and realms because of, like, how, you know, they're treating nature, which they see as quite beautiful. So I think this character comes with a lot of complexity that would be interesting to roleplay either in tabletop or in BG3. By the way, quick question before we actually get into the build. Sorry, this is a bit of a long intro. How do you guys feel about me doing level 20 builds in the future? Obviously, one of the big kind of patches that have come out with the new mods is the ability to now go to level 20. Obviously, the game is not built around level 20, but if I was going to do perhaps a level 20 build that maybe used Beastmaster Ranger, meaning that we could do a proper multi-class while still getting all of the Beastmaster abilities that come from level 11, because I originally wanted to do this as a Beastmaster, but it didn't really work out. I mean, hell, I'd love to do like 11 Beastmaster, 9 Moon Druid, just saying. So let me know if you would want to see that. Hopefully some more difficulty mods that can properly balance the game around level 20 will eventually come out as kind of patch 7 continues its lifespan. And again, this will be going up on the Saturday, and I meant to stream today. Sorry that I didn't really get around to it. Things just got more busy than I was expecting, so apologies. Anyways, without further ado, let's get into the build. Kicking things off, we are going to be a Paladin. Paladin felt appropriate for this, and again, this is one of the reasons that this video existed, is because we're going to be doing a class combo today that, again, up till now I thought I had done, but never actually did. And I think the combination of classes and subclasses that we're going to be using in this video are going to create a really interesting build. But starting off with Paladin is going to give us a ton of things that we want. Simple weapons, martial weapons, all types of armor, shields, if you want to go down that route. You've got a lot of options available to you. You could technically start with our other class as well if you want, because you can get all of those things, but I did want to get the Paladin stuff first, personally. So as far as this build's leveling scheme is concerned, take the levels in any order you wish. Just make sure you're getting to level 5 in one of the main classes, maybe respecking a bit later to just make sure you get that extra attack, because obviously if we are a full martial fighter, we're going to want those things. But of course, starting off as a Paladin, we get to choose our subclass, and of course we're going with the Oath of the Ancients. We are dedicated to nature. We fight on the side of... And this is kind of interesting, because it's a different way of kind of looking at the Oath of the Ancients, because the Oath of the Ancients means fighting on the side of light and the cosmic struggle against darkness to preserve the sanctity of life and the beauty of nature. Normally, the Oath of the Ancients are like a kind of oath that like help people out and are generally quite friendly people, but in this case, it's kind of twisted into being something a bit different. Now, of course, playing an quote-unquote evil Oath of Ancients Paladin throughout Baldur's Gate 3 will lead to your oath getting broken probably very, very quickly, so you are going to have to be a bit careful if you want to keep up that exact playstyle, but this build would definitely love to be an oath breaker anyway. We take this build to at least level 7 regardless, so no matter which of your aura effects you get, you're still going to have a pretty fun time overall. But I want to stick with Oath of the Ancients, and again, perhaps this character isn't solely evil, they just subscribe to a code that would maybe go against common morality, but to them is still seen as good, and an oath of good in your mind is just the oath that you've taken over yourself, even if it's not perceived that way by others, if that makes sense. So Oath of the Ancients or Oathbreaker will both work for this build. Maybe even Oath of Vengeance as well. Pick your poison, but I like Oath of Ancients more. Anyways, on to our ability scores. We're going to be using Dexterity as our primary attacking stat here. We are going to be focusing on using Finesse weapons with this build. Finesse, Finesse, who knows. Constitution I've put at 16 because I did want to have a bit more of a bulky character with this build. Wisdom is at 14 as it is going to be a spellcasting modifier, but not a major one for this build, and Charisma is at 12 for the same reason. Now feel free to change up the stats as you see fit. If you want to focus more on Paladin spells, go for more Charisma. More on our other class, which I'll just say it now is Ranger, go for Wisdom. But most of the time we shouldn't really need all these two stats to be high. If you really want to bump them up, bring the Helmet of Arcane Acuity or an Arcane Acuity granting item to bump up your spell save DC without having to sacrifice points in your martial stuff. And I want a higher level of Constitution because I want more HP and I want better concentration saving throws, as this build is going to be a bit concentration focused. As for our skill proficiencies, we are going to be able to grab a few things. I am playing the Outlander background because that just made sense. So we're going to get Athletics and Survival, but for our Paladin expertise skill proficiencies, we can pick up Intimidation and Persuasion, which means even with our slightly lower Charisma, we're still going to be pretty good at dialogue for when we need to be. Anyways, let's keep going. Next up, at Paladin level 2, we're going to get the main thing that we're here for Paladin, which is the Divine Smite, because even though we live in the shadows, you still need light to cast a shadow in the first place. See? I can be cool sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. Anyways, Divine Smite, obviously you know what it does. It stacks radiant damage on our attacks. Don't need to go into too much detail there. But we're also going to gain access to obviously our Paladin spells as well as a fighting style. And now for this fighting style, we're going to be choosing Great Weapon Fighting, but we will have the opportunity to pick up another one later from Ranger. But with Great Weapon Fighting, we're obviously going to give a bump to two-handed weaponry, which is, as you can see here, is what we're planning to use. But of course, for now, and if you plan to respec later, you could take dueling if you want to go for a sword and shield playstyle, which will be an option with the early game equipment if you so choose. But I think Great Weapon Fighting is going to work out better for us in the long run. We do also get to prepare 3 spells. I would say because of our lower Charisma and probably our lack of Arcane Acuity at this point in the game, I would say just pick up some stuff that's going to solely buff yourself that you don't really need to think about too much. So I would say Divine Favor is a great spell to have just for the cost of your concentration and the bonus action you get to do more radiant damage, which is fine for us. I would also say Heroism is a pretty solid option, making you immune to Frightened and giving you 5 temporary hit points each turn so you can get into the thick of it without having to worry as much about your HP. And finally, Bless, an overall great spell. You can also use Shield of Faith if you want a bit of extra armor class as well. Feel free to pick and choose what you like here. Next up, at level 3, you're going to gain access to Divine Health, making you immune to disease and any sort of disease, which is great. We're also going to be getting Nature's Wrath, allowing you to restrain an enemy, meaning that they cannot move, and you get the whole advantage and disadvantage that normally comes from restraining an enemy. So that's quite a fun thing to have, feels on theme for the build, getting slight druidic powers, as well as being able to turn the Faithless, allowing you to turn nearby Fae and Fiends, which I think is a fun little ability. Might try and do more with that as a theme in the future. Next up, of course, for our Oath spells, we're going to get Speak with Animals, which is huge, which is very druidic of us, as well as Ensnaring Strike, which we're going to be able to take advantage of a bit later. For our race, because we are a half-drow, we are going to get access to Fairy Fire at this point, allowing us to roll attack rolls with advantage against creatures that are affected by the spell. Can be pretty useful in select situations, but that long rest restriction does kinda suck, but I can understand why it's there. Next up, we do get to prepare another spell. Choose your favourite, really doesn't matter. I'm going to pick up that Shield of Faith because I've already mentioned it. Next up at level 4, we are going to get to choose our first feat of the build, and at this point, I would say probably you're going to want to bump up your ability score to 18 for dexterity, because dexterity is going to be our main stat all in all. We are a martial fighter more than anything else. Again, feel free to play around with these stats. If you feel like you don't care about the glove option that I'm going to be showing off in this build, just slap on the gloves of dexterity to get 18 dexterity anyway, and move your stats around a bit more. That would be a slightly more optimal way to play, but I don't like to rely on the gloves of dexterity if I don't absolutely have to, and with this build, we don't have to. This will give us the opportunity to add more interesting things into that slot to give us a bit more playstyle variety rather than just having a flat ability score bonus. But if you want more effective spellcasting with this build, feel free to slap those gloves on and put those points into Wisdom and Charisma as you see fit. Otherwise, I'm quite happy to just bump up dexterity here at this level. We're still at the early stages of the game, which means that we don't need to start hitting the higher power ceiling quite yet. Next up at Paladin level 5, we're going to gain access to extra attack. Extra attack is great, that's the main thing we want as a martial fighter. We also gain access to level 2 spells at this point, as well as our 2 oath spells, Misty Step and Moonbeam. Misty Step, great spell for a melee fighter. We're going to be able to get in and out of combat as much as we like, as well as Moonbeam being a druid spell normally just makes so much sense for this build, so I'm quite happy to pick it up here. For our race, we're also going to get Darkness at this point, so if you want to throw on the Eversight Ring onto this build and do some Darkness Devil Sight shenanigans, I nearly did the slip up again, you're going to have a good time with this spell. As for our prepared spells, I would say the game has chosen Aid, which is great. That's just going to make us even more bulky when we need to be. And I'm actually going to pick up Branding Smite here because I do think it will have some relevance for being able to do ranged smites, because part of being a ranger, which we're going to multi-class into on our next level for our level progression, I think it makes sense to be able to smite on ranged attacks. So I think that'll be quite fun. But let's keep going. So as I said, I do now want to multi-class into Ranger. You can do this at any point in the build, but we are going to be taking quite a few levels of Ranger, and I do want to get some of the abilities from that class to give this build that nature-y kind of feel, more so than normal. So let's go to Ranger now, but again, feel free to take the levels in any order you wish. For Ranger, we are going to get a couple of things at level 1. For the multi-class, you actually do get access to quite a few things, so for the record, if you're ever playing a class that doesn't get these proficiencies, and you multi-class into 1 level of Ranger, you can get all of these. A 1 level dip into Ranger is a really good dip for like a lot of Druids, if I'm being honest. So that's just there, in case you didn't know. But for Ranger, we're also going to get a bunch of stuff. We're going to get our favoured enemy, which is going to allow us to choose Bounty Hunter. Bounty Hunter is going to give us the ability to hit enemies with our Ensnaring Strike, and they have disadvantage on the saving throw. So even though we're going to have a lower spellcasting modifier, disadvantage on that saving throw is going to mean that skill is going to go off even more often. Of course, there are other appropriate things here. If you're starting as a Ranger, Ranger Knight would be great, giving you heavy armor proficiency if you want it. We are using medium armor with this build, so you don't have to worry about that if you're following this guide. But there's also things like Keeper of the Veil, which would give you proficiency in Arcana and protection from evil and good. Maybe don't pick that one. Mage Breaker, which would give you proficiency in Arcana again, and True Strike. Okay, yeah, definitely don't pick that one. So there's Ranger 9 Sanctified Stalker. Sanctified Stalker would work. You gain proficiency in religion and could cast Sacred Flame, which I do think would work for this build, giving you a bit of a cleric vibe. But we also do get to choose Natural Explorer. Beast Tamer could give you a Find Familiar. Urban Tracker would give you proficiency in Sleight of Hand. And Wasteland Wanderer, Cold, Fire, and Poison, respectively, each give you a resistance to that following elemental type of damage. Poison, I think, would make the most sense for this build. Druids are adept in poison. I mean, Nettie is a proof of that, as well as the fact that we're a drow. Natural resistance to poison does kind of feel on theme to me. So I'm going to be choosing that here, but again, any of these could work. And again, once you multi-class into Ranger, you also get a free skill proficiency from the Ranger list, which is going to allow us to pick up Nature proficiency, because even though it's only a +1, it would be a bit dumb if we didn't have proficiency in Nature, so there you go. Next up at Ranger level 2, we get to pick our second fighting style, and of course we want to fit that kind of nature-y Ranger vibe. We are going to be picking up Archery to give us a +2 bonus to ranged weapon attacks. We are now a ranged build as well as a melee build, and we could have been ranged up until this point. This is just going to help us out a bit more. The big theme of this build is I did actually want it to be both range and melee focused, and that's why we also picked up Branding Smite as well, so we can get that paladin feel with both types of attacks. Overall, it's going to feel like a very fun and quite diverse playstyle, which you pretty much have an option for most situations in combat. Speaking of, let's talk about that a bit more. Hunter's Mark, probably our primary concentration spell for this build. Doesn't have a saving throw, so we can pretty much always use it. It just adds extra damage to everything that we do as to the target that we mark, as well as being able to trigger some other things that we're going to be getting from our equipment. Probably, and again, it fits on theme with the build, so this is definitely something that I would recommend picking up. We already get things like Ensnaring Strike and Speak with Animals, and so since we have Ensnaring Strike from Paladin already, we don't actually need to grab that here. So let's pick up Hail of Thorns instead, giving us another ranged damage option that can cover an area. Again, with our lower wisdom score, you may find this not working as well in the late game, so feel free to just grab a utility spell like Enhanced Leap or Long Strider instead. Next up, at level 3, we do get to choose our subclass, and we are going with Gloom Stalker. This is a really fun combo to me for a few reasons that I will show you now. First up, we get Dread Ambusher. With our higher dexterity and a +3 bonus to our initiative rolls, we're going to be able to come out the gate swinging as a paladin, which is very, very fun. We also gain increased movement speed, allowing us to get to whatever range we want, be it far away for ranged attacks or close in for melee. And then we can make an additional attack on that opening round that does an additional 1d8 of damage. So think about it. You run in, do your Dread Ambusher, then your 2 Divine Smites. That's a lot of damage in the opening round, which is going to be extremely fun. We're also going to get Superior Dark Vision, giving us a further range of Dark Vision, which just makes sense for the build thematically. We're also going to get the ability to hide as a bonus action, so if you wanted to kind of maybe do some speccing into stealth with this build, you absolutely could go for those opening big smites that with advantage from hiding, and also the ability to become invisible if you are obscured. There's just a bunch of fun little thematic things here. The main thing that we're here though for is Dread Ambusher, but of course you have other options to you as well. We also get Disguise Self, so playing as a drow, that could be pretty fun. But Hunter also works as well. You'd get Hunter's Prey, which would allow you to get Colossus Slayer, just doing extra damage every turn, but I did link Gloomstalker a bit more for this build thematically, but if you feel like Hunter would be better, feel free to go with that. Probably not going to go with Beastmaster on this build, just because we're not going to hit a high enough level for the companion to really be relevant, especially into the late game. We're also going to gain access to another spell at this level. Choose whatever you like, really doesn't matter. I'm going to grab the aforementioned Enhanced Leap. Next up, at level 4 of Ranger, we are going to get to choose another feat, which means we are going to get our first damage feat, and you get to choose. If you think you find that the melee playstyle is better for you, pick up Great Weapon Master. We are going to be using two-handed weapons with this build, which means you're going to get a big bump to your damage at the cost of a penalty to your attack rolls, but we are going to be able to mitigate that in a few different ways with this build, as I'll get into later. But if you feel like you're preferring the ranged playstyle, then pick up Sharpshooter instead, basically doing the same thing but for your ranged attacks. I will say that this build is going to be getting both of these feats by the time that this build is finished, if you so choose. So feel free to choose whichever one fits your playstyle that you enjoyed the most now, and pick up the other one later. In my testing, I used Great Weapon Master first, so for the kind of 8 to 9 to 10 level range, and I do find that Great Weapon Master is a pretty solid pick at this level. We could pick up Sharpshooter a bit later. Or if you're going with the Gloves of Dexterity strategy, you could just pick up both straight away, and then have the last ability score improvement for whatever you want. There you go. Another way of doing it. Now, we're not going to be going to level 5 of Ranger. Level 5 of Ranger for Gloomstalker would give us extra attack and Misty Step. Both things that we already have, so we don't really need them. Let's go back to Paladin. For Paladin at level 6, we're going to get Aura of Protection, allowing us and nearby allies to gain a bonus to our saving throws equal to our Charisma modifier. Unfortunately, our Charisma modifier is only going to be a +1, but hey, 1 is better than nothing. The main thing that we're here for is Aura of Warding, meaning that we have resistance to spell damage. This is huge. This is for us and our nearby allies. This is why we are the Shadow Guardian. We guard things. We are a bulwark. We are a tank. We are able to resist a lot of damage, and Aura of Warding is going to help us with that. Spell damage is a big thing in this game, so, I mean, let's take it. And finally, at level 8 of Paladin, we're going to be getting our final feat, which, even if you think it's overkill, I still want it on this build, Sharpshooter. Now we have massive damage for both our melee and ranged attacks. I am also going to fix our prepared spell list, just to make sure that we have all the spells that I recommend for this build. Shield of Faith, Bless, Heroism, Divine Favor, Aid, Branding Smite, Magic Weapon, I would also recommend for this build as a solid concentration option to give all of your weapons a bit, whichever weapon you choose on your person, a bit more of a buff, I should say. We're also going to be picking up Cure Wounds, because why not? Healing is fine. And for your final spell, it's kind of a whatever you want type deal. Protection from poison if you didn't take Wasteland Wanderer poison could be fun if you just wanted to get it from a spell. I'm just going to grab Lesser Restoration. And that is the build, and well, with this, as I said, you're basically just going to be getting a kind of jack-of-all-trades type character. This character is able to do a massive amount of damage at both melee and range with things like Great Weapon Master and Sharpshooter, and the ability to smite on both melee and ranged attacks. Again, depending on what equipment you want to use, like the Gloves of Dexterity or the Amulet of Constitution or whatever, you will have the ability to adjust the stats as you see fit. Want to focus more on the Ranger stuff, put in more Wisdom. You want to focus more on the Paladin stuff, put in more Charisma. Either way, you're going to have a fun time with this build no matter what you choose to do, because you have so many options available to you. You could take battlefield control spells with the Ranger, getting things like Spike Growth if you want, so you have a bit of that. You have sustained damage with things like Moonbeam. You have the ability to, tank and protect your allies with your auras. You have so many different things that can work for you here. You have maneuverability thanks to Misty Step and the Dread Ambusher feature. And you even have healing thanks to things like Cure Wounds and Lay on Hands. And with things like Speak with Animals as well, you have a unique utility in dialogue as well, meaning that you just have so much working for you. With this build, you have roleplay stuff like Disguise Self, even and traversal stuff like Enhanced Sleep. This build just does a little bit of everything, and the stuff it does really well, it does really well. But with all that out of the way, let's get into the equipment. So the equipment is kind of what makes this build, in my opinion. So you are going to have to pick up a few very specific things as you go throughout the game, but once you actually have these items, this build is really going to come online. With the level progression that I showed in this video, you are going to be playing a pretty standard Paladin up until level 5, and by the time you hit level 5, you should have all the gear you need to really start this build going. So let's talk about the weapons first. First up, our weapon of choice is the Dancing Breeze. I originally wanted to go with a quarterstaff, a spear, or a pike for this video, kind of getting that druidic vibe, because druids are usually pictured with a quarterstaff, and so we could kind of make our quarterstaff into a weapon with a bit of extra sharpness, let's say. But I had a bit of trouble justifying getting strength in this build without potions of Cloud Giant strength. So if you wanted to go down that route and use something like the Unseen Menace, which was my original choice for this build, you absolutely could. However, I didn't want to rely on potions for this build if I could help it, so I decided to go for a Finesse two-handed weapon. That's the only one in the game, is the Dancing Breeze, which in my opinion fits quite nicely. But Dancing Breeze is something you can obtain in Act 3, so a little bit later into the game, but regardless, it's still worth it. It's a +2 weapon that, obviously being Finesse, is its biggest unique property, as well as the fact that it comes with Whirlwind Attack, which is usually a Hunter Ranger feature, and it still contains the Hunter Ranger animations, so you get like the leaves, like a leaf tornado kind of swirling around you as you use it, so it felt very druidic. You can only use it once per short rest as opposed to the once per attack thing on the Hunter Ranger, I should say, but I think once per short rest is more than enough to just do a big whirlwind attack. You've dove into combat, you're surrounded by enemies, and you just whisk them all away. You'll see in the combat footage that this can do a lot of damage in certain situations. So obviously the whirlwind attack here is just a fun feature. All of this fit quite nicely, and the name The Dancing Breeze, in my opinion, just fits the vibe that we're going for. Again, it kind of just looks like a druid quarterstaff has been kitted out with some sort of like runic blade. I just think it's perfect for this build. But of course, as I said, this is available only in Act 3, so if you want an early game option, I recommend either Falaraluf or Larithian's Wrath. Obviously, being a half-drow, something like Falaraluf would make a lot of sense. Being able to kind of use some maybe Alistrian kind of like religious practices to be able to get the blade, so if you wanted to go for that you could, or you could go for Larithian's Wrath, which is basically the same thing. They're both finesse longsword or a +1 enchantment, and this one comes with the Razor Gale attack, which I kind of liked a bit more for this build personally. Obviously Falaraluf would probably be the power option. And for our bow, we have the Dead Shot. This is just going to reduce the number needed to roll a critical hit by 1, and also we double our proficiency bonus when rolling ranged attacks with this weapon, unless we have disadvantage. So that is pretty much going to offset the Sharpshooter penalty altogether for us. Combine that with some other pieces of equipment that we have. So yeah, the Deadshot is basically the perfect bow for this build, but because it even looks kind of like almost like an enchanted druid bow as well. I don't know, this whole build, at least looks wise to me, comes together pretty nicely. But for your early game option, you do have the Titan String Bow, which is going to deal additional damage equal to your strength modifier. Even though we don't have strength, this bow always deals a minimum of an additional 1 point of damage regardless of your strength, so this is going to deal a bit more damage regardless. It's just an easy to get early game bow that you can just use until you get the main slice of pie right here. Moving on to the actual equipment now. First up, we have the Circlet of Hunting. You gain a 1d4 bonus to attack rolls against any creatures marked by Hunter's Mark, True Strike, Fairy Fire, or Guiding Bolt. For us, we're going to try and have Hunter's Mark up pretty much constantly, so getting that 1d4 bonus to attack rolls to offset both Great Weapon Master and Sharpshooter works quite nicely. Plus, it's just thematic for this build, but again, if you want to focus more on the spellcasting side of things, you can swap this out for the Helmet of Arcane Acuity if you so desire. Next up for our armor, we have the Sharpened Snare Cuirass, which adds your full dexterity modifier to your armor class, and creatures have disadvantage on saving throws when resisting your attacks and spells that inflict restrained. I've just realized this armor set does the same thing as Bounty Hunter, so maybe you don't need to take Bounty Hunter from Ranger, but if you want to go for a different piece of armor than the one I'm showing here, then feel free to swap that out and keep Bounty Hunter. But this is just a decent piece of armor that I think works good. Come on, mate, use your English. Works out pretty nicely for being kind of a armor set that still feels druidic in nature, working quite nicely for this build, both thematically and mechanically, and just looks quite nice. Next up for our gloves, we have the Legacy of the Masters, which gives you a +2 bonus to attack and damage rolls with weapons. Again, giving us a bit more damage, but also offsetting the Sharpshooter and Great Weapon Master penalties. But of course, this is an Act 3 option, so the early game option would be the Gloves of Missile Snaring, which allows you to intercept missiles from ranged weapon attacks, reducing their damage equal to 1d10 plus your dex modifier. This is basically the monk feature of deflect missiles put into gloves. Obviously, you can't throw them back, but since you get these from the Druid Grove right at the start of the game, it kind of made sense to include them on this build. So I think it's quite a fun early game option for you to use until you get the Legacy of the Masters. And finally, the Disintegrating Nightwalkers, because they're some of the best early game boots in the game. We're playing as a drow, so it fits, and it prevents us from being enwebbed, entangled, or ensnared, and cannot slip on grease or ice, which makes sense for this build, because again, we are going to be creating difficult surfaces if you decide to go down that route with the spells, so it helps out, and it also gives you an extra usage of Misty Step once per short rest. So overall, you are going to get quite a lot out of that, so I recommend those boots overall. But feel free to swap them out if you like something else. And next up, for our, for our accessories, we have the Broodmother's Revenge. Of course, this is Karga's amulet, so it makes sense to pick this up. You can get this from her in a few different ways, but of course, if you don't feel like you want to use that in case it messes up, you know, the role play of being a Shadow Druid, you can get something else, but I did want to include it in this build. Whenever we are healed, our weapon becomes coated in poison damage, a d6 of poison damage to be exact, which feels perfect for a Shadow Druid type build. Of course, this means we will need to heal ourselves to do it, so if you want to pick up the Ring of Regeneration to automatically get this buff every turn, you absolutely can, but of course we have access to Healing Radiance and Lay on Hands to trigger this feature regardless, as well as the ability to just drink potions anyway. Next up, we have the Risky Ring. If you feel like even with all of these ways of offsetting the Great Weapon Master and Sharpshooter penalties that you're still not landing your attacks as consistently as you would like, the Risky Ring will give you advantage on all attack rolls, with the exception of giving you disadvantage on saving throws. And this is a risk you're going to have to weigh for yourself. Advantage on all attack rolls basically guarantees that your attacks are going to hit, which is great, but your in concentration spells like Hunter's Mark or whatever are going to go down more often than you would like with this ring equipped. So if you feel like with all of the equipment that you have, you're able to kind of manage your accuracy a bit better, then feel free to drop this ring entirely. But if you feel like you do need it in order to hit those big attacks and keep it equipped, just maybe you might want to lean more into the Ranger playstyle so you're less likely to get hit by attacks. And finally, since we're going to be healing ourselves anyway, we might as well get the Whispering Promise to give ourselves or our allies, if we healed them as well, a shorter version of Bless, an extra 1d4 bonus to attack rolls and saving throws for 2 turns. So that saving throws are going to help us with our concentration, and attack rolls are going to help us with our feat penalties. But yeah, there you go. That is the build. For the record, all of the outfit pieces here are coloured in the black and summer green dye, which is a vanilla dye, just so you're aware. But yeah, that is the build, and overall, like I said, what you're getting out of this is you're getting an absolute powerhouse that can both not only deal massive damage, but also tank quite a bit of it as well, thanks to the Oath of Ancients aura of warding, as well as having little ways of doing extra things here and there, both roleplay and battlefield control wise, as well as the healing too. This build can just do that little bit of everything, and it's going to feel extremely fun to play. It feels powerful and it feels effective, and again, there's lots of room for optimization and changing things up here and there where you see fit. This is just kind of my way of doing the build that doesn't rely on the same pieces of equipment that I use as a crutch in all of my other builds, and I do think this build still works really well. You just have to kind of play with and adjust the ability scores as you see fit. Now that I'm looking back on it, maybe swap that Wisdom and Charisma, making Wisdom a 12 and Charisma 14, but it's entirely up to you. And as you can see from the combat footage, this build does kind of eradicate my standard encounters pretty goddamn quickly, with just the absolute sheer amount of damage it does. I mean, it is a Paladin at the end of the day, and the fact that we're combining Paladin and Ranger here means that you still have the same amount of spell slots that you would have had if you went with a full Paladin. So in reality, you're not really losing anything there either. You're just getting the extra buffs from Gloom, Stalker, or Hunter, or whatever, if you decide to go down that route, and combining it with Paladin's usual stick to just get a ton of cool stuff. And again, I was really surprised that I had never done a Ranger Paladin build before. I haven't. Somehow. I looked it up. I hadn't done it. Don't ask me how. It seems like a pretty obvious combo. And I like the fact that we got the Shadow Druid lore worked into here. If I ever make a Shadow Druid build that is actually a Druid, I would absolutely pair it with this build. So let me know if you want to see that. But anyways, I think that is going to do it for me for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.